Software restriction using group policy. As an administrator, there's probably a lot of applications you don't want your users to run. Whether it's games that you don't want users wasting company time playing, older versions of software that just aren't secure anymore, or perhaps they're problematic, or malicious code or scripts from doing bad things to your network. Well, with Windows 2008 group policy, we can use software restrictions to prevent these applications and scripts from running, as they enable you to have complete control over what software is allowed to run in your environment. Now, there's 4 types of software restriction policies available in Windows 2008. The first is a certificate rule, and we can use certificate rules to ensure that pre-approved applications are digitally signed, and this enables us to ensure that the files are authentic and not some virus in disguise. We have hash rules, which run a quick algorithm over the file to create a hash value to uniquely identify the file. Because of this, hash rules will always apply even if the file is renamed or moved to a different location, such as a different folder. However, if the file changes in any way, for example, let's say the file was a script and then it was edited to add in some additional code, or an executable file was modified by a hex editor, then the hash would have to be reapplied to be effective. Now, next we have network zone rules that apply to Windows installer packages, and they identify software that comes from network zones that you'd already be familiar with, especially if you're an Internet Explorer user, and these are things like the Internet Zone, the local intranet, restricted sites, and so forth. And finally we have path rules, where we can specify the locations of files that are allowed or not allowed to run. With path rules, if a file is moved from the location specified in the rule would therefore become ineffective. And path rules, they can also apply to registry keys. So let's go and create some software restriction rules. So we're going to go and click on Start, and we'll go to Administrative Tools. And we're going to fire up the Active Directory Users and Computers console first, since in the real world, you'll most likely already have a hierarchy of OUs and users that you'll want these software restriction policies to be applying to. So we're going to right click in our domain here, winstructorlab.com, and we'll go and create a new OU. And let's give this new OU a name. I'm going to call it Restricted Users, and we'll click on OK. Now we'll go and select our Restricted Users OU, and inside this OU I'm going to right click. We'll create a new user account, and we'll need to give this guy a name. I'm going to call him Lucas, and we'll make his UPN the same. Now we'll click Next, and we'll give Lucas a password, and we'll type it in again to confirm it. And finally, I'm going to uncheck user must change password at next logon, and I'll set it so his password never expires, and we'll click Next, and then Finish. Now we're going to click on Start, and we'll choose Administrative Tools again, and this time we're going to launch the Group Policy Management console. And over on the left here, we're going to expand our forest. We'll expand the domains container here. We'll expand our domain, winstructorlab.com. And we're going to right click on our Restricted Users OU we just created, and we're going to choose the top option here to create a GPO in this domain and link it here. Now, the reason I want to apply my software restriction policy at this OU, by the way, is that software restriction policies are user targeted policies, and in this OU here, this is where I have the users that I want to be affected by the policy. Remember, software restriction policies are targeted at user accounts, not computer accounts. So bear that in mind if you create them and you wonder why they're not working. Alright, well, we'll need to give this policy a name. I'm going to call this one Software Restrictions. And we'll click OK. Now we'll expand our Restricted Users OU here, and we'll right click on the Software Restrictions policy, and we'll choose Edit, and that's going to start up the Group Policy Management Editor. And since software restriction policies are user-targeted policies, under the User Configuration heading, we'll expand Policies, then Windows Settings, then Security Settings, and if we select Software Restriction Policies, let's just move this over. In the right-hand side of our console, you'll notice that we don't have any software restriction policies defined. So we'll need to right click on software restriction policies and choose the top option here, new software restriction policies. And that'll then show us on the right here the two containers that we need, security levels and additional rules. So if we open up security levels in the right hand side of our console here, you can see we've got three options. We have disallowed and unrestricted, both of which were available in Windows 2003, and the basic user policy, which is new to Windows 2008. Now as it stands, the default setting here is this unrestricted one, as evidenced by the hard to see little tick here that's covering the icon, which I might add was a lot easier to see in Windows 2003. So it does go to show that not all changes are great ones, but hey, if that's all I've got to complain about, then life can't be too bad, I guess. Alright, well these policy settings here are your global settings, and depending on which one of these three you have active, will determine whether software is disallowed from running, whether software is going to run as a basic user, or it's not restricted from running at all. So since group policy is set to this unrestricted by default, then it won't be affecting our users' ability to run software. Their rights to run software will only be governed by the user's normal access rights at this point. But if you wanted to disallow or prevent, if you like, all software from running, which is certainly going to make your systems more secure, but it's going to lock your users out from doing anything at all, which probably means that they'll also be getting out of doing any work. But if you wanted to do this, you'd simply right click on disallowed and then choose to set it as the default. Now if we did set the default to disallow, users won't be able to run any applications regardless of their access rights unless we explicitly create some rules to allow them. So this policy is super restrictive, and in a highly secure environment it could be useful. Sure, most of you listening to this video though probably aren't going to touch this policy, but if you're running a secure environment, and let's say you've got a contractor who's been brought in to work on a particular application, you could create his account in a restricted OU and then apply a policy like this to prevent him from running anything, and then create another policy to allow him only to run the application that he's there for. Now, the new option with Windows 2008 is to run software with only basic user credentials, even if you are an administrator. So if you decide to enable this option and you need administrative rights for certain features of an application, then you'll be unable to use those features unless you log in with an account that isn't affected by this policy. I'm going to leave the default as it is to unrestricted, and we'll go and click on additional rules. In this additional rules container, you can see we've already got two path rules here, which is just pointing to a couple of registry keys. Now on the right, we can see here that the setting is unrestricted, meaning people can run applications from both of these two locations. And if I expand these out so we can see where they're actually pointing to, you can see that they're actually pointing to the Windows directory and the Program Files directory, two folders you're likely to be quite familiar with. In fact, if we locked out these two folders, you probably wouldn't be able to do much at all, since pretty much everything comes from one of these two folders. For example here, if I was to right click on one of these and select Properties, and then change the selection here from unrestricted to disallowed, and then apply this policy, then users would no longer be able to run any executable file in the Windows directory. Now the same also goes for the other default path rule. If we were to set that one to disallow, then users won't be able to run applications that are stored in the Program Files directory. And you can imagine either of those are going to be super restrictive. Okay, well let's cancel this for now, and we'll look to creating our own rules, since that's where you as the administrator is likely to want to go with these rules. So to create a new rule, we'll just right click anywhere here, and we've got 4 different types of rules. We can create a certificate rule, a hash rule, a network zone rule, or a path rule. And these are the rules that we briefly discussed at the start of this video. Now these are all pretty similar though, so for our demo here, we're going to choose a hash rule, and this will open up the new rule dialog box, where the first thing we'll need to do is tell it which file we want this rule to control. So to locate the file, we'll click on Browse, and we'll navigate to the path where you have a copy of the file. So let's assume that we don't want our users to be able to run the Windows calculator. Now, we're on a Windows 2008 server here, so I'm going to browse to my C drive first of all, my Windows folder, and we'll scroll down and locate our System32 folder because that's where the calculator file lives. And I'm just going to type in calc.exe and we'll click on open. Okay, well here's the file information to calc.exe, and although this might look like information that you're ordinarily going to skip over, this section here is really important. Here we can see that the Windows calculator is currently sitting at version 6.0.6000.16386. Now I might add that Windows Vista also uses the same calculator version, but Windows XP is different. And in all honesty, for the life of me I can't figure out what differences exist between the XP version and the Vista or 2008 versions of the calculator, but there must be some since their file versions are different. And this is important because if we just click on OK here, which in effect is going to make this policy active, and since people who are applying this policy are a member of the Restricted Users OU, and if they're using Windows 2008 or Windows Vista and they try and run the Windows calculator now, then they're going to be denied. However, if they're using Windows XP, then they'll be allowed to use the calculator since the file versions are different, and our hash rule here only specifies this version of the Windows calculator. So let's try it anyway. What we're going to do is we're going to click on Start, All Programs, we'll go to Accessories, and we'll launch the Remote Desktop Connection tool, and I'm going to connect to a Windows Vista machine in this domain, which I've simply called Client 1. So we'll connect to that. And we are going to connect using the Lucas account that we just created a moment ago. And we'll click on OK. Okay, well we're logged in, so we're going to click on Start. We'll go to All Programs, Accessories, and we'll try and launch the Windows calculator. Okay, well our calculator has been blocked from being executed from Lucas, just like we'd hoped it would be. So our policy here does work fine. That is, of course, as long as Lucas is logging into a Windows 2008 machine or a Windows Vista machine. So let's try and log Lucas onto an XP machine just for kicks and see what happens. So we'll go and firstly log him off of this machine. And we'll go and fire up the Remote Desktop Connection tool again, and this time I'm going to try and connect to Client 2, which is a Windows XP machine. And again, we're going to log on with Lucas's information. So now we'll go and click on Start, All Programs, Accessories, and we'll launch the calculator. And there you go. It runs just fine. And that's because in our hash rule we specified the calculator, but not all calculators are the same, as you've just seen. So let's just log off here. And we're going to go back here and we'll create another hash rule. But this time when we click Browse, rather than locating the calc.exe executable, which of course is going to be from this machine, Windows 2008, we're going to enter in a UNC path to the calculator file that exists on the XP machine we just logged Lucas into. So that's going to be client2/C$/Windows/System32 and followed by the executable of calc.exe, and we'll click Open. And this time you can see quite clearly that the file version for the XP calculator is different. This is version 5.1 and the Vista or 2008 one is version 6. So when we click OK, here you can see we've now got two hash rules. Both of them are for the Windows calculator, but each file it's pointing to is a different file. So we'll click on Start again, All Programs, Accessories, and we'll run the Remote Desktop tool once more. We'll go back to our XP machine and we'll get Lucas to log back on. And we'll click on Start, And we'll try and launch the calculator. And this time, Lucas is denied the ability to run the calculator as it's been blocked by group policy. So the rule of thumb here is make sure that you create the hash rule for the operating system or file version that you want the rule to apply to, or it simply won't work. And I can't stress this enough. If you don't want calculator running at all in your network, then you'll need to do this for each version of Windows that you're running in your environment. That means potentially Windows 2000, XP, Vista, 2003, and 2008 machines. Now it's really important that you remember this, since if you're wondering why your hash rules aren't working as intended, then this is likely going to be a cause of the problem. Now the next type of rule we're going to take a look at is a path rule. And from here all we need to do is enter in a path to a location that we want to allow or disallow files from running. So for example, in here we could enter in %systemroot %/system32, and this is going to prevent users from running applications in the Windows System 32 directory. And in fact, thinking back to our calculator example we used a moment ago, we could use this path rule. Then regardless of whichever operating system we had, the Windows calculator wouldn't be able to run in any case, as the file would be stored in this location. The downside to using path rules is that if the application is copied to a different location, the file can still be executed by the user. And I might also point out though that preventing users from running anything in this System32 folder probably is going to cause more problems than it solves, since there's some pretty important system files existing in this folder. Now another thing we could use a path rule for is a wildcard type entry where we could restrict certain file types from running. So let's say we didn't want users to be able to run VB script files. Well, we could simply create a new path rule and then specify an *.vbs and then disallow it. And if we click OK here, now users won't be able to run these scripts. And this also brings me to the next type of rule, which is a certificate rule. Now, we just configured a path rule so we couldn't run VB scripts, but we can use a certificate rule that lets us run these scripts if we have a valid digital certificate. So we'd simply press browse here and then browse for a certificate. And if we select the security level and set that to unrestricted, then anything that has a certificate, including VB scripts, then they'll be allowed to run. Now that brings me to another point, the order in which these rules are processed. Now, when an application is launched, it's compared against this list of rules you have here. Now, the first type that gets evaluated is the hash rule. Now, if a hash rule is found in this list here and it's set to disallow, then the application is prevented from running. End of story. Now, the next type of rule to be evaluated is a certificate rule, followed by a path rule, and then the network zone rule. So, in our example of using a certificate to allow a VB script file to run, it'd first go along and check any hash rules that we have, and since up here we don't have a match to disallow them, it's going to move on and evaluate any certificate rules. Now if we had one, and let's say that we do have one that allows signed scripts to run, then it would stop there and it'd work fine. But any other unsigned VB scripts would make their way through the hash and certificate rules, and then it would be evaluated by our path rule here, where we've configured to disallow any VB script files from running, so they're not going to work. Alright, well the final type of rule we have here is the network zone rule, and if we select that, we can set our network zones to be disallowed, unrestricted, or just set to basic user rights. So we'd simply select the network zone, and let's say we'll choose our local intranet zone here, and we'd probably want to set that to unrestricted. That way users could access our intranet sites. So we'll click on OK. Now we could add in another network zone rule, and we could set, say, our internet zone to disallowed. And that'd be a good choice if we didn't want any users to access the internet. These are the 4 types of rules that you can create. So let's go and take a look at some of the other restrictions that we can put in place. Now on the left hand side here, if we click on software restriction policies, in the right, you can see these three other options here: enforcement, designated file types, and trusted publishers. Enforcement, this allows us to decide whether our software restriction policies are going to apply to all software files except DLLs, or simply all files. Now, leaving the first option here is a pretty good idea because a lot of the applications are using shared DLLs, and if you choose to apply this to all software, then any applications that are using these shared DLLs, they're not going to run, and then you'll be called in to fix the problem, which isn't a good idea unless, of course, you're charged by the hour. Now, we can also have these restrictions apply to all users, or all users except local administrators, and this is probably the choice that you'd want to go with, because as administrators, we often need to be able to run applications with additional privileges in order to do our jobs. So restricting the administrator, often it's not a good idea. Although I will admit, administrators often are the worst offenders. We run applications that really aren't appropriate for business use, and I guess that's both a blessing and a curse of being an administrator. Now, our next option here, designated file types. Here's where we can define what type of file constitutes executable code. Now, there's a rather long list here of predefined file types, and most of these you're going to recognize, things like batch files and exe files and .com and VB scripts and so forth. But if you don't find what you're looking for, you can certainly add in your own here by simply typing in the file extension that you want and then clicking add. Now, finally, at the bottom we have trusted publishers, and this is where we can specify who can select trusted publishers, whether we'll leave that up to the end user, or if it has to be an administrator or an enterprise administrator. And before trusting any publishers, we have the option of checking the publisher and the timestamp to see if the certificate has been revoked. So that's software restrictions. They're pretty easy to implement, really, and they work pretty much as you'd expect them to. And they can be useful to implement in your organization, not only to rein in your users, but to prevent malicious applications and code from running rampant in your network. Now, remember that software restrictions are targeted at users, and the order in which you apply these rules is also going to play an important role in determining if the rules are applying as you expect them to. Remember, hash rules, they're evaluated first, followed by certificate rules, then path rules, and finally network zone rules. So remember that, and the fact that when we looked at hash rules, that the file version is an important factor in determining if your rule is going to work as intended, and you should be fine. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.